Do you remember that old story about David and Bathsheba? What if I told you that the point of that story isn't really about adultery? Hey there, and welcome to Redeemer Online Church, where we are here to help the physically scattered to digitally gather and grow spiritually. And this conversation is the second part of a series that we're calling Canceled: How to Stop Reading the Bible Like That. The point that we're making in this series is that the Bible isn't for you. It wasn't written for you, it wasn't written about you, and it wasn't written to you. And I promise that all of that is actually really good news for you. Because when we read it like that, we tend to misinterpret and misunderstand it. And we tend to then use it to misunderstand and mistreat one another, and maybe even ourselves. So the promise that I'm making in this series is that when you let go of reading the Bible as though it was written for you, you'll begin to discover that there's actually so much there for all of us, whether you're a religious person, a Christian, or not. So, how do we stop reading the Bible as though it was for us? Well, it starts with asking different questions. Instead of immediately asking, what does this mean for me? In our first episode, we talked about asking, who wrote this and why did they write it and for whom did they write it? The author and the original audience. And you can go back and learn more about that by clicking here if you want. But in this conversation, we're going to ask questions about context. Because taking parts of the Bible out of context is probably the leading cause of all misunderstandings and misinterpretations. Now, there are two types of context to wonder about when reading the Bible. There's a literary context and a cultural context. We're going to talk about the literary context in this video, and then we'll look at the cultural context in the next one. I think it's safe to say no one likes being taken out of context, because context is a huge part of what gives meaning to our words. So let's talk about how this works, given my ridiculous statement off the top. What if I told you that the point of that story isn't really about adultery? There are really three overarching questions you want to ask to understand the literary context of any Bible passage. But first, let's look at the story we're trying to understand. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man who was sent said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. And she came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. And the woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." Oh. Then David has this whole back and forth exchange with Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. He tries to get Uriah to leave the war effort and to come home and to sleep with his wife, but Uriah refuses to do it. And so after a couple of attempts to coerce him, David then demands that Uriah go back to the war effort and be put on the front lines of battle, where he ends up dying. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And after the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Now, you might think, Corey, how could you possibly say that this isn't a story about adultery? It's right there. The thing David did displeased the Lord. Clearly, the point of the story is that adultery is bad. How could you say otherwise? All right, fair question. While it's true that this story contains adultery and seems to indicate that it's bad, it's not the point of the story. And we miss that point when we read this story out of its context. Understanding context is everything. So, the first question to ask when it comes to understanding the literary context is this: what book is the passage in, and what is the point of that book? So let's answer that. This story takes place in what we call 2 Samuel. But 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book that were a part of a 5-book box set you could call the history. It included books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is just Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, which is really just one book called Kings. The history box set follows the people of God from the arrival into the Promised Land all the way to being conquered by Assyria and Babylon. The subtitle of the box set could be From Entrance to Exile. Now, in last week's episode, we mentioned the first box set in the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and how it was written down by Moses for the people of God and answered the question, who are we and whose are we and how should we live with this newfound freedom? The history box set is different. It would have been collected and compiled for the people of God while they were in exile, as in after they had been conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And so the questions that box set answers are, how did we get here? How did it all come to this? How did we end up going from freedom in the Promised Land to being conquered by some other nation and carried off into chaos? Now, 2 Samuel in particular tells the story of King David in the midst of that larger narrative of entrance to exile. You could almost retitle 2 Samuel as the rise and fall of King David. In this story, known as David and Bathsheba, it functions as kind of the apex or the hinge between David's rise and its fall. Okay, fine, you might say, but how does that mean that this story is not about adultery? Well, I promise we're getting closer. Just stay with me. First, let's ask the second question for understanding the literary context. What happened right before this in the book? What led up to this story? What led up to this moment? Well, if you give the first half of 2 Samuel a speed read, you'll see a young King David on the rise. It starts out with him showing kindness and humility toward the former king who actually had tried to kill him, which is kind of impressive. And then from that moment on, things just go awesome for David. I mean, he ends up uniting the kingdom, expanding the territory. He conquers the city of Jerusalem and makes it the capital city of God's people. I mean, as far as being a king goes in that day and age, he was crushing it. And more than that, he was reaching out to the descendants of former enemies and he was turning them into friends. He was helping out the needy and the less fortunate. In every way, things were looking up for the kingdom of David. And this whole rise sort of culminates in this final conversation between him and a prophet named Nathan. David says to Nathan, hey, tell God that I want to build him a house to live in, a temple here on earth. I mean, all the other nations' gods have temples here on earth, but our God doesn't. Let's build him a house on earth. And then God tells Nathan to tell David, thanks, but no thanks. I don't need a house to live in. I go where my people go. I don't need a building. It's always been that way, and it'll always be that way. But I will build you into a permanent house here on earth. I'll establish a dynasty through you, and a future king will come from your family line whose kingdom will never end. I mean, David's crushing it. Kingdom's going great. Everyone's comfy. God makes this amazing promise for a lasting legacy. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? And sometimes comfort can breed complacency. Oh, and because he was comfortable, he wasn't guarding himself against lust, and that's why he committed adultery, right? Or maybe he was bored in his complacency, and that's why he went strolling on the roof and committed adultery, and that's the lesson. Don't get comfortable or complacent because you might commit adultery. Not quite. Remember that this isn't a story about the dangers of adultery. And to cement this, let's ask the last question to help understand the context. What happened right after this? What was the fallout? What was the outcome? You see, after the incident with Bathsheba happens, Nathan the prophet returns. And he has a funny story to tell to David. He said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, it drank from his cup, and he even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man, and he prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man in the story and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." In other words, it was completely unacceptable for that rich man who had everything in the world to take advantage of this poor man and to steal from him, to rip the one he loved from his arms and to take it for himself. It was a completely selfish and unjust thing to do. And David could see it clearly. That man has to pay. And then Nathan said to David, "You are the man." In other words, it's not that his adultery was okay. It absolutely wasn't. But if you read the story again, the first 4 verses tell of the adultery part, and that's what we always focus on. But the next 22 verses, the rest of the chapter basically, focus on how David treated Uriah, a foreigner, a poorer person, a disadvantaged man. David used his privilege as a king to steal from someone much poorer than himself. And then he tried to use his position as king to intimidate Uriah into complying. And when that didn't work, David used his power as king to get rid of Uriah altogether. Complacent, selfish, unjust. He abused his power in multiple ways. And as a result, absolute chaos erupted in the kingdom. I mean, shortly after this, one of David's sons rapes his own sister. Another son then steps in and kills that rapist's brother. David's son Absalom rebels against David along with a whole bunch of others. The kingdom gets divided and fragmented, and eventually David has to flee and go into hiding for a while. And even though eventually he does get back to reclaim the throne, the book ends with a much different David than it started with. It ends with a broken David, a broken king, and a broken kingdom. So why tell this story? I mean, the people of God sitting in exile don't need the story of David and Bathsheba to tell them that adultery is bad, and neither do you. And besides, David's not exactly a shining example of monogamy at this point. He already has 5 or 6 wives before he adds Bathsheba to the mix. Now, the David and Bathsheba story, when understood in its context, it has a dual purpose. The first purpose is that it's a reminder for the people of God in exile that selfishness, injustice, and abuses of all kinds lead to chaos, which is why they ended up getting conquered and carried off in the first place. But that's not all this story reminded them of. It was also a reminder that even in the midst of an absolute mess, God was at work among and through some of the more deeply flawed people working to bring about his plan. You remember that promise that God made to David right before everything went sideways? A king from his own line would establish an everlasting kingdom. That was actually kind of an echo from a promise that God made to David's ancestor, Abraham. God promised that he would establish Abraham's house, that Abraham's family line would bring a light to the nations, that they'd be a blessing to all people on earth. And that promise got reaffirmed in David and kind of brought into focus, a promise to establish a future king on earth who would bring about a kingdom that would never end. And so as the exiles read this story, they're also reminded not just of the chaos that landed them there, but they're reminded that even in the midst of the worst moments, God is still at work finding a way to bring light to all people. Now, you may or may not know this, but Jesus actually claimed to bring that promised eternal kingdom. And he claimed to be setting up that kingdom not in heaven, not somewhere else, but here on earth. That it would be a place for all people in all time to be blessed. A kingdom not of selfishness or injustice or abuses of all kind, but of selflessness, forgiveness, and service of all kinds. A kingdom whose king would give everything for his people rather than take everything from them. See, if you read the story of David and Bathsheba out of its context, as though it was written for you or about you or to you, you may end up walking away with with an unnecessary misinterpretation, like don't get comfortable or complacent because you might commit adultery. Or, adultery is bad because if you get pregnant and not everybody's willing to play ball, somebody might have to go to the front lines and die. Adultery isn't bad because David and Bathsheba's story tells you so. Adultery is bad because it breaks trust in relationship. And without trust, relationships don't work. And without relationships, family and society would fall apart. And that's all true. But that's not the point of this story. And understanding the greater context helps us see that. This story is a reminder to the people of God in exile of the chaos that gets unleashed when they lived selfish, unjust lives. And it answered the question, how did we get here? But after asking those context questions and considering the author's intent and who the audience is, now we can ask the question, okay, what does this story mean for me, for you? And I think the answer to that is twofold. First, it's a reminder that our acts of injustice and selfishness and abuse of all kind, big or small, that they unleash chaos into the world. And it's not hard to turn on the news or scroll your feed or look in the mirror and just see it. And that chaos, in a way, it exiles us from God and from each other. But that doesn't have to be the end of the story. This passage also reminds us that by the grace of God, every single one of us, despite our flaws, mistakes, and regrets, we all have the potential to be used by God to bring about more love, more joy, more peace in this world, more light in the dark places. That's why Jesus came. He stepped into the chaos and invited us to follow him into another way of existing, a way that can bring hope on earth for something better, something for everyone. And that's a hope that will never end.